Okay, whether you're doing cognitive psychology or cognitive science, cognition is about knowledge, how knowledge is acquired and represented and used by minds and brains and machines. And social cognition is about social knowledge, how we get it, how we represent it in our minds, and how we use it in the ordinary course of everyday living. The first of these questions is, where does knowledge come from? And if my slides would just work for me. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Someday, we'll figure out how to do this. Okay, basic problem that we're going to approach right now is, where does knowledge come from? The philosophers gave us two answers to this. One is a nativist view that has its origins, at least in modern philosophy, with the work of Descartes, and it basically argues that our knowledge is innate or a priori. It comes to us before experience. Descartes thought that a priori knowledge was a gift of God. He was a dutiful son of the church. More recent people who take a nativist view argue that knowledge is somehow part of our evolutionary and genetic heritage. The alternative view is an empiricist view of the origins of knowledge, and it comes to us from a group of mostly British philosophers in the 18th century, Locke and Hume and guys like that, who argue that knowledge comes from experience, and especially that knowledge comes to us through the senses. We acquire knowledge by virtue of sensory experiences and our reflections on those experiences. Put another way, we acquire knowledge through learning. It's this empiricist view of knowledge that has guided cognitive psychology and cognitive science for most of their histories, though, as all of you know, I think from earlier coursework, there is an argument that can be made that at least some knowledge is, in some meaningful sense, innate or a priori. But what we're going to do in this course right now is to focus on the contributions of the empiricist view of knowledge acquisition and focus on the importance of sensation and perception. Now, just to review the bidding a little bit, let's make a couple of distinctions that are important between sensation on the one hand and perception on the other. Sensation, for our purposes, really has to do with the problem of detecting the presence of some object or event in the environment. It has to do with what happens when certain energies emanate from a stimulus, fall on the receptor surfaces of the body, whether the eyes or the ear or whatever, are transduced into neural impulses that then get transported or transmitted to the brain, leading us to say, oh, there's something out there, something's happening, there's an object in my world somewhere, detecting the presence of a stimulus. Perception, as we're going to treat it here, has to do with forming a mental representation of that stimulus. That is, getting some sense of what that object is that we've just detected in the environment, what its form is, that is, what it looks like, what it sounds like, where it is in the environment. Is it over here or over here? Is it near to us or far away? And what it's doing. Is it stationary? Is it moving or whatever? But more important, the act of perception doesn't really get finished until we have identified the object, categorized the object, as well as determined what the object's various kinds of states are. So the task of perception is to form a mental representation of the distal stimulus, the object of perception, a mental representation that is, in part, the product of whatever information is conveyed by the stimulus to our minds, but also, as we'll see in a little while, there's more to it than that. So in the non-social case, if you take something like Psychology or Cognitive Science 126, the perception course, you'll notice that analyses of perception really tend to focus on the form and the location and the motion of objects in the environment. I think that accounts for roughly 12 of the 15 weeks of a standard the perception course, how we separate figure from ground and determine the shape of the object, and the principles of depth perception and the principles of motion perception and all of that. In the social case, what we're trying to represent is a little bit different. Yes, in some sense, we're trying to represent the physical appearance of the social stimulus in the world. Let's just think of it as another person for a moment. Is it male or female? Is it black or white? Is it tall or short? Is it fat or skinny? Those are not very different from what perception is all about in the non-social case, but that's only where things begin in social perception. What we're really trying to perceive, what we're really trying to form a mental representation of in the social case is what the other person is doing mentally, what this person's thoughts are, what his or her feelings and desires are, what his or her behavioral dispositions are. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to mentally represent, and those are the kinds of pieces of information that we're trying to get somehow from the stimulus input. So when we perceive people, what we're really doing in social perception, as far as social perception is concerned, is we're really trying to figure out what's going through their minds. What is it that they want? What is it that they feel? What is it that they think or believe? What is it that they're intending to do? And although I don't explicitly spend a lot of time on language in this social cognition class, the reason for that is, and if you look at the syllabus, you'll see that there's no specific syllabus topic devoted to language, even though language is an important part of cognition. It's because language is thoroughly involved with social cognition right from the beginning, not least because our percepts of people, our impressions of other people, are formed on the basis of language. Here is a pretty clear example of that. This is information from the Washington Post in 2007 as the last presidential race was beginning to heat up. The Washington Post surveyed a fairly random sample of the population, and there were something like 35,000 candidates for the presidency at that point. If you'll remember, it was quite a messy election year. And they simply asked them to come up with the first three words that came to mind when they thought of various presidential candidates. This is a very interesting way of displaying this kind of data. It's called a word cloud, where the size of the word is proportional to the number of times that the particular word came up in people's reports. It's not your usual kind of pie chart or something like that, but you really get a kind of sense about what people are thinking of when they look at when they think about these characters. This is how people perceived Barack Obama in roughly at the end of 2007, their impression of him was contained in words like this: inexperienced, liberal, Democrat, black, young, good, and intelligent. We don't have to worry about exactly what they are, but the point of this is that this is how we perceive other people. We perceive other people very much by using the medium of language. This is an equal opportunity course, so there's the Republican candidate, John McCain, okay? And you can see that there are a couple of words that really kind of stand out with McCain: veteran, honest, good, old, POW, Republican, and so on. But again, this is people's impressions of his candidate. Now, just for good measure, here's another one of those candidates, John Edwards, who handsome, lawyer, young, good, likable, Democrat, family, and so on. Just goes to show you that our impressions of people are not always accurate, right? I mean, we now know, right, that John Edwards isn't quite like this at all. Well, liar does show up there, but that wasn't the dominant impression of people at the time. So again, as our experience of John Edwards has changed, so do our impressions of him have changed, and that's probably the case for Barack Obama and for John McCain as well. We're always acquiring information through experience, through sensory experience. What we see when somebody gives a news conference or a State of the Union address, or stands up with his wife to say he fathered a child by a woman who he wasn't married to, and tried to get his aide to assume responsibility for it, and all sorts of interesting things. And all that information, that's information in the stimulus that then feeds into our impression of these people. And what we want to know is, how does that happen? Okay, how is it that we take information from us provided by a stimulus and use that information to form an impression of that stimulus, a mental representation of that stimulus that then serves as a guide to action? Well, there are historically basically two views of this perceptual process. The older one, associated with Hermann von Helmholtz, a perception theorist, pioneering psychologist back in the middle of the 19th century, is known as the constructivist view. And what Helmholtz argues is what I kind of talked about in the very first lecture of this class, is that the stimulus is inherently ambiguous. That is, that there are lots of different percepts that are compatible with any particular pattern of stimulus information. So that perception is not accomplished simply by extracting information from the stimulus. Can't be accomplished that way because the stimulus doesn't provide us enough information to tell us where it is, what it's doing, and the like. Instead, Helmholtz argued that we have to supplement information provided by the stimulus with information that we already know. We have to supplement it with inferences based on the pre-existing world knowledge, beliefs, and all of that kind of stuff. Helmholtz argued that some of these inferences were actually proceeded unconsciously. It's Helmholtz who gave us the term unconscious inference. We don't have to talk about that right now, but the general idea here, as Jerome Bruner put it in one of the great phrases in all of psychology, the perceiver must go beyond the information given in the stimulus in order to form a mental representation of the stimulus. If there is the Thomas theorem may have been the most important sentence ever uttered by an American sociologist. This phrase, going beyond the information given, is probably the most important sentence ever uttered by an American psychologist. The idea that there's more to perception than extracting information from a stimulus. Now, this idea wasn't original with Bruner, though Bruner has a real talent for the aphorism, and he kind of captured this Helmholtzian constructivist view, which is to say that we build up our mental representations of objects and events based partly on information that they provide and partly on information that we contribute from memory. This constructivist view of perception dominated the study of perception for well over 100 years in psychology, and in my view, still and properly dominates the study of perception. And that's true for social perception as well as it is for non-social perception. But more recently, there has been an alternative ecological view put forward by by an American psychologist, now deceased, the late James J. Gibson, at Cornell University, who argued against Helmholtz, and for that matter against Bruner, for what he called an ecological view of perception, which basically says that all the information you need for perception is in fact provided by the stimulus environment. And our perceptual apparatus, the apparatus that we use to see things and hear things and smell things and taste things, has evolved in such a way as to extract the information from the stimulus that allows us to see or hear the stimulus the way it really is. Gibson's own pithy phrase is, all the information you need for visual perception is in the light. It's all in the stimulus. You don't need to rely on any kind of internal cognitive processes. You don't have to worry about making inferences about what's out there. It's all out there. All the information you need is in the light. You don't need to do anything else to it. Okay, this Gibsonian view is sometimes called direct perception because Gibson argued that perception was not mediated by cognitive processes, that there was a direct connection between the stimulus and the percept. And it's also sometimes called direct realism because Gibson argued that by virtue of these evolved perceptual mechanisms, we actually did see the world the way it really was. This tension between the constructivist view of perception that began with Helmholtz and the ecological view of perception that was basically articulated by Gibson and his followers is a tension that is still with us. In these three lectures, today and on Wednesday, I'm going to focus on studies and theories that emanate from the constructivist view of perception. But on our last day, next Monday, I'll talk about some applications of the ecological view to social perception. But again, let's look at social perception, impression formation from the constructivist viewpoint. Now, earlier I made the point that our percepts of people, the impressions that we have of them, are captured in language, like those trait descriptions that were associated with the various the presidential candidates. But the real question that we want to approach first from the point of view of understanding social perception is, what's the stimulus? Okay, what's the stimulus that we're supposed to be extracting information from and making inferences about and so on? And here we see the other side of the importance of language, which is that language is very often the vehicle by which information about a person is conveyed to us for purposes of perception. Take a fairly mundane example. Your roommate sets you up with a blind date for Friday night. His sister's coming into town and says, yeah, let's go out, And you say, well, what's your sister like, And he says, well, she's pretty nice, she's kind of smart, she's good looking, she enjoys horror movies and things like that. He tells you what she's like, and you're immediately forming an impression of what this person's like. You haven't met her yet. She's not physically there, right? You haven't talked to her, you haven't tweeted it or whatever it is you people do. I don't do any of this, right? I don't Twitter, I don't have a Facebook page. It's bad enough. If I could, I'd still be using Windows 3.1, honest to God. But language is a very important vehicle for conveying information about a person from one person to another. No better example of this, I think, can be found than personals ads. I'm a happily married man. I haven't read a personals ad in a long time except for my work. But if you've ever gone to the backs of the newspapers or the East Bay Express, or my favorite is the New York Review of Books, you'll see people advertising for people. People want to get together with people. And what they do is they write a personals ad in which they try to say something about themselves that presumably will be attractive to at least one reader of the personals ad, so that they'll tweet each other and get together or whatever. So here we go. Single Jewish male, 39, British, seeks single Jewish female who prefers baseball to Berlioz, Katz's, that's a delicatessen in New York, Katz's to Kafka, and sex to reading the New York Review of Books. Now, that's almost a haiku-sized thing. I think it's not any more than 17 syllables. But you really begin to get an impression of what this guy's like, right? You have some sense of what he's about. He at least knows who Kafka is, even if he preferred to be munching a Reuben, and all of that. So you begin to get a sense of what he's about, what kind of person he is, and what he wants. Mostly, he wants sex, not reading the New York Review of Books. And then you can kind of figure out whether you want to deal with that or not. Sometimes they get a little bit longer. Married Jewish male in New York City, likes museums, nature, ferry rides, long walks, long talks, sushi, needs a special female friend. Okay. Ex-Wall Street, now professional writer. Okay, now what does that mean? Ex-Wall Street, now professional writer. Did he give up, the Wall Street, or was he fired, or whatever? We don't know. But you're going to think about those kinds of things, right? 40-something. 40-something means 49. Okay. 5'9" means 5'6", okay? Fit and muscular, schlumpy and dumpy, right? Attractive, maybe. Creative, playful, irreverent, intense, affectionate. What are those trait adjectives, right? This applies the whole thing for you. Thoroughly analyzed. This is the New York Review of Books, after all. Self-aware, very flexible weekdays. Very flexible weekdays. Why is he not flexible weekends? Because weekends he's got to be home with the wife and the kids, right? Okay? Non-smokers only, please. Like he's got standards, okay? Photo appreciated. But as soon as you read something like this, you begin to get a sense of what this guy is like, right? And the way you get a sense of what this guy is like is not just by reading the words, but by starting to make inferences. Oh, he says he's 5'9", he's probably shorter. Oh, he says he's 40-something, that probably means he's on the high end, or whatever, okay? Whole stories can be conveyed here, but not just by the literal words of the stimulus. Here we go. Pretty warm, romantic, 56, 5'4", New York City, feminine, female, as opposed to open, creative, musical, intuitive, professional, seeks confident male, 57 to 65, who also wants to rebuild a happy life. There's a whole Tolstoy novel in this personal's ad, right? And you really get a sense that there's some kind of drama here. Okay, beautiful live woman in mid-40s, rare blend of art and intellect, simplicity and elegance, financially and emotionally secure, seeks man equally at home in the world, who knows himself enough to know a good thing when he finds it. Meaning, her ex-husband didn't. Okay, or her boyfriend, or whatever it was. Okay, now we're not making fun of these people, but I want you to see there are wonderful stories here, and some of it's kind of humorous and some of it's kind of pathetic. But the point is that this is the stimulus information for social perception in so many cases. And when you read these things, you don't just take this at face value. You go beyond the information given. You read between the lines. You make inferences. You generate hypotheses that you might get a chance to test if you met such a person. Okay, see what he or she is really like, and then okay, I think that's it. Okay, but you kind of get a sense of what this is all about. It's this process of forming an impression of another person based on whatever information is available, information that typically comes in the form of language, of words, often of trait adjectives and things like that, that is attempted to be captured by the whole process of person perception, a phrase that was introduced by our friend Jerome Bruner. He was everywhere in the 50s and 60s, and the wonderful cognitive psychologist, who argued that persons, just like Necker cubes and duck-rabbit figures and all of that, could be the objects of perception. And Bruner and Renato Tajuri, who was his co-author on this paper, argued that, discussed in a seminal paper in 1954, kind of what the influences on perceptual organization are. First, there's the stimulus array. The stimulus array of the person, his or her behavior, verbal productions like this, or whatever, that provides the information for perception. There's also selective attention. You go to an ad like this, and the first thing you want to do, you look at certain kinds of things first. You have men seeking men, or women seeking men, or men seeking women, or whatever. You focus your attention on various kinds of information. Maybe some particular word will jump out at you and say, oh, that's interesting, or whatever. Okay. Then there are linguistic categories in which we select this information. The categories provided to us by language. And then finally, Bruner and Tajuri argued that our perception was also determined by the internal state of the perceiver. What the person's mental state is. Are you reading the personal's ads just for enjoyment? Are you doing it just to prepare a lecture? Are you doing it because you really desperately need a date or whatever? And also other aspects of the emotional and motivational context. How you feel and what you want and what you feel deprived of is going to depend on how you perceive the person. They've taken their shot. They've written the personal's ad. That is their stimulus. They are the stimulus. That's the stimulus. And now you have to try to perceive them through the medium of this stimulus information. I actually like the personal's ads a lot because the personal's ads capture the essentially dialectical feature of impression formation, which is that there's a person who's a stimulus. There's a perceiver who's trying to form an impression of the stimulus, and at the same time, the stimulus is trying to convey certain kinds of information to the perceiver in order to inculcate a particular kind of impression. These people write these personal ads deliberately and with malice aforethought. Go home tonight. This isn't homework. You're not going to turn it in or post it to the website or anything like that. Write a personal ad for yourself. Even if you're happily related to somebody, it doesn't make any difference. You can collaborate on it together if you want. And then think about the process of trying to present yourself to a stranger. What do you want them to know about you? What do you not want them to know about you quite yet? What kinds of inferences do you want them to make? And how can you make sure that they make the right kinds of inferences? The dialectic between impression formation, which is what the perceiver does, and impression management, which is what the stimulus does. The stimulus, who's a sentient, conscious being who has goals and motives and beliefs and all that kind of stuff. That's a very, very, very interesting, dynamic. Okay, so that's Bruner and Tajuri. At roughly the same time, Solomon Asch, who is probably better known to you from your introductory psychology course for his studies of conformity and perception, famous Asch conformity experiments, same guy. Asch was actually a perception psychologist. And the conformity experiments were actually intended not so much as social psychology experiments, but as perceptual psychology experiments.